Welcome back to Hell to Pay. This is Elle.
And this is Amr.
And today we are talking about one of the most interesting movements in evangelical Christianity that came from America, of course, and has become really popular around the world. So by way of introduction, in 2015, an Atlanta preacher named Creflo Dollar, that's right, dollar as in the currency, asked his followers to help him buy a Gulfstream G. He said,
"Your name Dollar, and yet you don't have money to buy a jet. Curious, much to think about."
Can I get a dollar? Dollar, dollar, dollar.
And he need a dollar. That's what I need. Hey, go on.
And I'm sure he's heard all the jokes before, and why not? He said, "So if I want to believe God for a $65 million plane, you cannot stop me. You cannot stop me from dreaming. I'm going to dream until Jesus comes." Presumably on a private runway. Only this particular belief was a little more earthly because his last private jet had actually recently crashed, taking off in London, which of course was pilot error, not God, not Creflo. And then that same year, it was a banner year for the private jet industry. Kenneth Copeland. So he's a guy with the really fucked up, mangled face, he's old and it's just pulled so tight that he's kind of going a bit cat lady, who did that really weird maniacal laugh on camera about Biden's 2020 election win. He also purchased a Gulfstream V-jet worth about $54 million. And of course he said it's for his ministry, not for himself. And then he said, glory to God, it's ours. The Gulfstream V is in our hands. And then on his TV show, which is called The Believer's Voice of Victory, he had a segment with Jesse Duplantis, who's another famous evangelical preacher. And in this segment, they sort of talk to the audience about the difference in using commercial airplanes and private jets. And how the thing is, they all, every preacher of the private jet always says this, it's needed for them to spread the gospel more effectively. And they basically said that, look, they need these private jets because flying on a commercial plane is like flying with a bunch of demons, which is a direct quote. And Duplantis even called in mention of the time when he had to unbuckle his seatbelt to be able to speak directly to God.
Do you think if you explained all of this to Martin Luther, if you told him before he nailed his theses on the door in Mainz or wherever it was, we could draw a direct line from this to you, do you think he would have still done it?
Oh God, yeah. No, I mean, he it just would have tormented him. He would just would have done, I don't know, 20 years of, kind of Opus Dei style. He would have stuck one of those things in his leg.
Cilice. Yeah, I mean, the Catholics are their own type of weird and corrupt, as we've covered on this show many times. But at least they have class when they're corrupt, right? At least they obscure it with all sorts of liturgy and theatrics and the outfits and the churches and all of that fairly reasonably well obscured. Whereas a guy just showing up and being the Gulfstream is in our hands, glory to God, that's just so quiche. More than anything, is just so low class. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. There's no veneer of ritual. There's nothing else. It's just completely transactional. Give me money, get good stuff.
Yeah.
And then with a veneer, the thinnest fucking veneer of God and morality and things like that on top of it. But yeah, I do find it pretty mystifying, as I think a lot of people do. And I mean, it doesn't really take much gospel scholarship, to know that Jesus was not super big on this kind of stuff. He's the dude who overturns the money changers tables in the temple. One of his favorite quotes one of his sort of better known quotes from Matthew, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who's rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. So how, people that profess this stuff pretty regularly, how can they then go on to be saying, buy me a private jet? And, as we'll come to see, some of these preachers, said things like, riding a donkey back then was the equivalent of having a Cadillac now. And yeah, and not only could they have the temerity to preach these things, but have a devoted band of believers who are right on board with them? And anyway, so the idea, of course, I'm talking about is prosperity theology, sometimes kind of colloquially known as the gospel of health and wealth. And basic idea is that if you believe in God and your community, you give generously to your church, then you'll receive back riches of mind, body, spirit, and wallet many times over.
Back then, the only way you can get a girl to go to prom with you is to have a donkey. Girls don't go to prom with someone who doesn't have a donkey. Much like a Cadillac.
Right. That's right. Yeah. If it's just a mule. Are donkeys and mules the same thing?
No, mules are, I believe, different, like subspecies or a species. I'm not sure. I know they're different.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're just walking, you're out. Even though, I mean, Jesus.
I think the mule is a hybrid between a donkey and a horse.
Yeah,
but it's different from like there's difference between a mule where the male is a donkey and the female is a horse, and the other thing, which is male horse, female donkey.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
I didn't know you knew so much about donkeys and mules, but there we go.
I aim to impress, but go on.
I'm very impressed. So to go back to the origins of prosperity theology, it begins in the early 19th century when the mentalist and mesmerist, which just to the idea of them being a mentalist just always amuses me.
They don't make jobs like that anymore.
No,
all the
they do
mentalist
not.
jobs went to China.
Yeah. And now that it's being automated.
Yeah.
Yeah, called Phineas Quimby, starts promoting all these ideas about mind power and self-healing and spiritualism, which paved the way for the New Thought movement. And that's then, sort of taken on by people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and other thinkers of the sort of late 1800s. And, really just once again with the idea of a healthy mind leads to a healthy body and spirit. And of course, again, that's inseparable from America that's emerging at the time from the Civil War to become this global superpower. So, it's really heavily charged with Protestantism, rugged individualism, and that frontier culture that, still, moving across America, killing and enslaving everyone that's in your way, and manifest destiny and the whole package. And so then shortly after that, Pentecostalism kicks off in Los Angeles in 1906, and it really brings together a lot of the real evangelical currents that are running through America at the time, and, particularly the revivalist tent camp cultures, and a lot of stuff that's been floating around, again, particularly since the Civil War, and really speaking to a lot of poor and marginalized people. And there's a lot more stuff that goes on in the early Pentecostal movement, but it basically kind of splits off into black and white churches, distinct. And then, so a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about now will take place in the white branch of the Pentecostal movement. So you've got leaders like E.W. Keenon and Charles F. Parham, who were, really into faith healing and were themselves heavily influenced by New Thought. And they really started bringing a lot of the New Thought ideas into what is now Pentecostalism, sort of, really creating what we understand as now Pentecostalism. Then there's a dude called F.F. Bosworth. So he's an evangelist and radio pioneer. He starts taking the ideas, once again, faith healing, just for understandable reasons at the time. I mean, not knowing a lot about medicine, not having access to, to medicine, what medicine was known about for most people was really, just such a big deal.
To be fair, isn't this the time when, like, you were 50-50 likely to be prescribed arsenic or cocaine or something as you were to be given, like, actual medicine?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you were poor as well, I mean, you had even less of a chance. And what little was known about medicine, things like, what's the name? John Adams' wife, she was like really into she was like an early proponent of vaccines and like getting a dying person with measles or whatever, or smallpox, cutting them and taking their blood and putting it in your own. So some stuff like that was known about. But there just, just wasn't the access and especially, the frontier just kind of keeps rolling on and then obviously into, the early 20th century. Yeah, faith healing for most people was still the biggest game in town. And I mean, I would still argue for a lot of people in America and large parts of the world, it still
Well,
kind of is
with
today.
the one big beautiful bill being passed, I'm sure for a lot of people that's going to be their only game in town again.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I can't stop repeating this enough just to digress, but the big beautiful bill, I had to type that out the other day and I just could not stop laughing. It's just like we're all inside this man's head now.
Yeah, this is his world. He's won. Even after like he leaves or whatever, if he leaves, he's won. This is his world.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's like some really interesting twists on theology that probably don't sound like a lot, but they really, really change. And you can sort of see a lot of strands of American Christianity today. That some of these early kind of faith healers and pioneers of bringing together new thought and evangelical Christianity. So Kenon, he was like much more of a fundamentalist. So he was really like, we've got to dominate faith. But whereas Bosworth was like, we need to have victorious faith, which is taking and using what God offers to us. And this really laid the groundwork for where the movement led. Because of, all these ideas of healthy mind and body came from, belief that you had a healthy spirituality. It doesn't take much of a leap to see how then you can extend that to other areas of your life, particularly your financial life. And then it really melded with, those ideas of domination and victory over faith. So then it sort of becomes like being victorious over hardship, conquering the ills in this life, and rather than being liberated from them. And these are ideas that would come to be really big outside of the United States as well, for, I think fairly kind of obvious reasons as we get into it. So Pentecostalism is really getting going in North America after the Second World War. And obviously, so is this, what would become, sort of this global hegemonic power, the United States. So there was, that brought forward
The
a flood
Fourth Reich, some are calling it.
Yeah, so once again, we're just gonna, the dossier that's gonna get me deported from the United States is getting larger and larger. So it brought forward this real flood of optimism in these American ideas. But at the same time, particularly like business leaders and faith leaders really saw it as a time for vigilance, because of course the other, big things that had happened recently, well, firstly, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal and the economic safety nets and the state services and things like that was providing. They weren't particularly keen on that. And then there was obviously, the godless Reds who were sweeping Europe. And so a lot of business and faith leaders got together and said, America's on a slippery slope towards communism. Ha ha ha. And really found common cause in blending faith and business and faith in capitalism together. So they're really busy merging the languages of business and the Bible. And Pentecostals, who were often looked down on by evangelical counterparts, they were just really busy stoking revivalist fires. They're just like number ones in, converting. They're like, the Alabama football program of like, just recruitment. They've just got it down pat. And really sort of forging this new vision of Christianity. And its prophets were really big at pioneering media technology. So things like syndicated radio and cassette tapes. And so getting their message just out from their local church or from their local radio station and bringing together uniform ideas across the country. And while this is all going on, there was a movement within Pentecostalism called Latter Rain in 1946 that took off in Saskatchewan. Is that how you say it?
Saskatchewan?
Yeah, in Canada.
Yeah, Saskatchewan, yeah.
So once again, we can, the United States is the source of so many problems, but Canada always gets a word in.
We do have some decent second-round draft picks of various, expelled Nazis, Shaw Palavist guys, etc., and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't even said it yet, but that's definitely another episode one day. And so, basically in the Latter Rain movement, this renegade Pentecostal preachers came together and came up with like a kind of doctrine, I suppose you'd call it, that instead of tarrying, which is waiting on the blessings of the Holy Spirit to fall upon you, those health, wealth, speaking in tongues, prophecy, or that kind of thing. These preachers believe that they could instead receive God's gifts on demand. And so this kind of idea of ask and ye shall receive became a mantra that really took off. And obviously in areas such as faith healing, the kind of new thought ideas that had been percolating for a while, this became a really popular idea. So it's where you get the things like the laying hands. And so, yeah, they said, we're not going to tarry anymore and just pray until God suddenly comes to me and I start rolling on the ground. We'll just get the whole congregation to come and lay hands on you and like heal you, and then you get out of the wheelchair and everything's great. And so all this stuff kind of really began being popularized by preachers such as Oral Roberts, one of the great American names. And then obviously, mass media continues and the word's able to get out further and further through radio and cassette. And then in time TV, a lot of these guys became the early televangelists in the US.
This is why podcasting is necessary. You need to have podcasts to counterbalance the radio station guys, the Bible guys on radio and things like that.
Yeah, you need everyone from like Saskatchewan to South Africa or whatever just to be able to listen to Lex Friedman interview someone for like 8 hours about something that he's just read on Wikipedia.
Or the Pod Save Johns for that matter.
That's the monoculture that we need, that we deserve.
Yeah, I don't know about need, but certainly deserve.
Yeah, it's certainly deserve, yeah. So we'll just give a shout out. So a lot of this history, it's a fantastic book if anyone's interested. It's called Blessed, A History of the American Prosperity Gospel by an author called Kate Bowler. I think she's actually Canadian as well. And I think she teaches at Duke Divinity. But it's a really, really, really cracking read and just on, it's almost a century American, evangelical history as well. But she is she wrote the gospel on the prosperity gospel. And she sort of says that, what we now call the prosperity gospel, it inverted the well-worn American mantra that that things must be seen to be believed, and said that the gospel rewards those who believe in order to see. And you can kind of see like the foundations of mind power and things like that in that kind of idea. And Pentecostals were really at the forefront of embracing this mind power culture and the miracles and how it could be, turned into miracles of healing and prosperity and things like that. And so these new ideas that are kind of getting together, they really get supercharged in 1952 by the publication of Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking. So it's kind of like the iconic self-help book of the 1950s. So he's a New York preacher. So he was Methodist and then Reformed, I believe, leader. And his basic idea was like this simple formula, which says pictureize, prayerize, and actualize. So it's like, see it, pray for it, and it'll happen. And it's basically been the foundation of like so much of self-help ever since. So,
yeah, what's the difference between this guy and like Gladwell? This is just like the same bullshit. This is just Atomic Habits. What the fuck is going on?
Yeah, it all goes back to Norman Vincent Peale, I'm telling you. And needless to say, like, a New York at that time, which is, just cracking on at a pretty fair pace and just has, money and migration and all these things just flooding into the city. He was a hugely popular preacher and was getting his ideas out, all across the country. So he was the preacher at the Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue, and it was kind of, famously became standing room only. But there was one family in the front who, I think paid fairly handsomely probably for the privilege, and that was the Trump family. So Donald Trump grew up in that church and was a big fan, and I believe that Norman Vincent Peale, I think, married him and Ivana in the 80s.
I wouldn't say Trump is a fan of anything. I mean, the disdain to which he talks to evangelicals is actually one of the things I like the most about him. Like, whenever he goes on there and he's like, you like this, don't you? You like the Bible, don't you, little pigs? Oink, oink, oink. And they're all like, yeah. And he's like, you like the Bible.
I know. Look, and there are some quotes which I definitely don't believe of how, he was like captivated and things like that.
God knows. No, I don't believe that.
Because, well, I mean, speaking of Gladwell, you know my theory that that Trump kind of indicates his 10,000 hours rule just because he's like such a television savant. And I think I calculated that Trump must have watched like probably at least 200,000 hours of television in his life.
For 100%. Like, he is the most television president of all time. And like, I mean, he's also the first poster president, but like his I mean, it's not just that he watches TV, it's that he understands on an instinctual level what makes good TV. Like, in a way that, like, naughty, like you could get a committee of, like, the best PR guys in all of New York, like the modern day Mad Men people, and you can try and get them to, like, make a candidate popular on TV, like any given random Democrat or Republican candidate, and they wouldn't even be half as good as Trump is when he's just, like, just shooting from the hip. Just the other day, he forgot the Japanese prime minister's name, and he called him Mr. Japan, which is genuinely funny. I'm sorry. He really is a funny guy.
Yeah, his nicknames have so much riz. Yeah, I mean, and also, remember the time he forgot Tim Cook's name from Apple and he called him Tim Apple?
Yes, which is so sick. I love him. And like some of the things he does, like when he was like, and Pete Buttigieg, who rides his bike to work with his husband, not that there's anything wrong with that. He's just so good on TV. He's the most TV guy of all time. And like the reason I bring him up is that like I don't think he's ever believed in anything. Like, doesn't he sell Bibles? He sells like autographed Bibles, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he'll sell anything. But yeah, I mean, I guess he's, a fan is, but look, one thing that he did, he really got into the law of attraction, which all came from Norman Vincent Peale. And that's probably best. There was like a self-help craze in 2006 called The Secret, which is like one of those things. It would be in the top selling, like, I don't know, 20 books of the century. It's actually an Australian woman, Rhonda Byrne.
Didn't they make a movie out of that? Or?
Yeah. And it's just, I tried to read it once for something that I did about like, to do with this history and the history of like manifesting, and it's just fucking torture. And you know, like on TikTok today, there's like a zillion different things that are based on the law of attraction, like a lot of numerology. There's so much stuff about manifestation. You see it. Yeah,
I wonder
it's, like,
how
really
much
rampant.
The Secret, and this is just like, I'm just thinking right now, how much of that contributed to the resurgence of modern day astrology? Because I feel like astrology has come back really hard.
It has, yeah. And numerology as well is like really big in a lot of like charismatic Pentecostal churches and things like that. And then also on like, within astrology. And I've recently been researching a long read on stuff on kind of a lot of things that are happening on TikTok, like in the spirituality space on TikTok. And it's all kind of based around like manifesting, with like sprinkles of astrology, numerology, prosperity gospel, all that stuff kind of tied in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And law of attraction, comes back to Peale. So he's like, when you expect the best, you release a magnetic force in your mind, of which by the law of attraction tends to bring the best to you. So that is actually like you can kind of see like a lot of Trump's kind of ideas in that, you know, like he only wants to be surrounded by like attractive people and like people who look good on TV.
Though I will say, like, and you notice it a lot with Trump too. I mean, Trump 1 to an extent, but Trump 2 for sure, is like, all of the people who want to get in his orbit get the same type of surgeries and procedures. So like there's like a template, like a cookie cutter template for what he thinks is good looking, especially with women, but you see it with men as well. It's kind of disturbing.
Yeah. Christy Gnome's just got like that. She must have that like thing behind her ear that's like just a twisting, like it's just a tightening every morning that she can just get up and do that. And Paula White Kane's got the same, like their faces are so tight. There's no way it like just must feel like having like permanent sunburn or something.
It's like the meme of Homer with like his fat being pulled to the back. But
and clipped. Yeah. It really is, yeah. And it's like it's just a very aerodynamic look.
Yes.
So anyway, so all this stuff's really taking off. That's now, you know, morphed into all these other things like The Secret and law of attraction based stuff. And then as well, you know, it sort of popped up a lot in the mind, body, spirit trend that was in both Christian and secular thought in the 60s and 70s, whether it was from like hippie culture or just stuff that came after that. Once again, I think you can see a lot of like traces of it back to New Thought, and you can kind of see how it branched off from the kind of Christian culture. And I mean, Kate Bowler, whose book I mentioned earlier, she she basically says the prosperity gospel is the American gospel of pragmatism, individualism, and upward mobility, where churchgoers learn to use their everyday experiences as spiritual weights and measures. And then this really kind of coalesced in the 1960s around Kenneth Hagin's Word of Faith movement. So he was really heavily influenced by Kenyon, and it was basically the idea that's now known as seeding, or the seed of faith, where sowing a small amount of seeds helps you reap a harvest in return. And yeah, just again, coming back to Trump, I guess, where you can see like there's all sorts of overlaps between these different movements, you know, the narcissism of the small difference. But what they all did was best actually summed up by Trump in 2016, where they were asking him like, you know, what Peel had given his faith when he was really starting to try and you know, gear up his run for president. And he said like, what I think is, really actually quite appealing to a lot of people is that Peel gave him bringing real life situations into his sermons. So he obviously just talked in less spiritual terms, but in terms that mean a lot to people. And that's something that is really, really big. You know, really successful preachers do that much more now and, you know, can translate, you know, I once sat in on quite a powerful sermon in like Mozambique with this preacher who was sort of like, oh, everyone's, you know, coming to me and, you know, seeing all their friends' lives on Instagram and saying how, you know, how much better everything is for them. And he just kind of translated it into a sermon about, you know, not coveting your neighbor's possessions and, you know, and how this is, you know, how it's very bad spiritually for you. And that's, that's something that prosperity gospel preachers have really mastered.
Yeah, I mean, it's relatable. One of the things I really didn't like about the Friday prayers when I used to go, because my dad took me, is how like a lot of the imams were either not relatable at all, so like all the stories they tell you are like early Islamic stories, or if they were relatable in the bad way where like Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon and TV are all satanic and we should not do that. And it's like, what kind of kid wants to go and listen to some guy say everything the kid is interested in is bad? Like, it's just boring.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I bang on about this a lot, but that's why the Pentecostal movement, to my mind, is one of the reasons why it's really taken off and just sort of swept most Christian traditions before it, is because it's like uplifting and it makes people feel good. And it's like, if you're, you know, a poor person working 2 jobs and, you know, only have a small amount of time for your faith, you don't want to be told that, you know, you're going to hell because you haven't done this particular thing. It's like, it's, you know, it's very Tony Robbins, but it's like, people just want like to be uplifted and then to go back to their shitty job and, you know, just to have enough spiritual nourishment to get through all of that.
Yeah. I mean, religion, for the most part, occupied the role of consecrating people's lives. And, like, if the people whose lives you're supposed to consecrate, if they're not relating to you, then, like, they're not going to find any of this appealing. Like, it won't apply to them. They need to feel like that this is part of their spiritual life, at least, like part of their cycle, if you will. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It reminds me, what was that viral tweet a while ago that was saying, like, you know, the average Catholic is just like, how can I help the poor today? And like the kind of trad cath convert is always, you know, is on about like some schism from
I will butcher everyone in the Nicene Creed for like, you know, doing the wrong interpretation or whatever. Yeah. And I think, I think that holds true. Yeah, the people that aren't, you know, in need of this kind of spiritual nourishment, that you do see them like go just become like, just crazy trad cath or orthodox or something to get into this particularly academic form of Christianity. But obviously for most people, they just want, you know, shit to help them in the here and now. And so all of this kind of comes together. And so prosperity gospel preachers who, you know, really taking off in the 60s start saying things like, well, you know, God cares about how much you have in your pay packet at the end of the week, and that, you know, Jesus was actually wealthy, donkey's equivalent of a Cadillac, baby Jesus, you know, what did the 3 wise men bring him? Gifts. Myrrh, frankincense, and something else.
They brought him merch, right?
Yeah.
You know, having guards at the crucifixion, we're like living in a gated community today. They would say all of this shit with a straight face, and obviously people believed it. And this then spread well beyond America. So these ideas, really trickling down the Atlantic between the 1950s and 1970s, particularly to non-Mexican countries in Central America and to Brazil. And again, as we've kind of talked about in past episodes, it really was the gospel of health and wealth, particularly among the poor in rapidly urbanizing Brazil. And then in Central America, there were a series of earthquakes, which I think in Guatemala, it left a quarter of the population homeless in 1967, I think maybe, that brought American missionaries, with aid and Bibles and their new way of doing church. And then, once again, these ideas of helping you in the here and now and not just saving your soul. And then the ideas of prosperity, for understandable reasons, really started taking off. And just in terms of numbers, so Pentecostals and Charismatics were 58 million in 1970. And by 2020, that number is 635 million globally at best count. And I think that there's way more than that, because you've just got more Catholic churches taking on stuff. You've got all these other different denominations really taking on these ideas because so many people have been converting. And the main driver of conversion to Pentecostalism is more often than not prosperity gospel. And so, it's just really big in parts of Africa as well now, anywhere in the developing world. And the kind of epithet that's used is that if you can name it, you can claim it. So they basically say, if a preacher can say that anything good in your life, he's responsible for it. And that's when you get those really grotesque versions like Copeland and Creflo Dollar. But admittedly, they are kind of on their way out now. They are they do feel a bit like watching like an American sitcom like Dynasty or something now. Just that particular kind of look and those aesthetics.
The righteous gemstones.
Yeah. See, it's kind of just parodied today, right? And to the point where Creflo Dollar even sort of renounced the prosperity gospel in 2019. Because, I think that one of the things, if you're going to be a very successful preacher that can just ask your congregation for 65 mil for a private jet with a straight face, you do have to be pretty good at least in kind of picking up where the wind is blowing and, sort of seeing what people are going to buy kind of literally from you. And so I think that's where we see newer versions like Hillsong and these really corporatized, very slick mega churches. So instead of some people are still asking for it and will still do it, but they're much better at selling you merch. So it's buy tickets for our concerts, buy tickets for our online education course, give to this, community event, or we're going to build a new center and things like that. They've become much, much smarter at kind of doing prosperity gospel in sort of more tangible ways.
They're like successful trots. They get to sell newspapers, but actually people are buying.
Yeah, basically. And another thing, it's always been rife. We talked about in Opus Dei, but labor exploitation is another big thing. So it's you mightn't have, much money to give, but if, lovely young woman can look after the pastor's children for 40 hours a week for free and, basically raise them on their behalf, that is giving as well in a way that will reward your faith many times over. And my kind of, I guess, overarching theory on that is that it's really just conforming to the secular world. And, people sort of rightly, I suppose, deride a lot of prosperity gospel ideas and people getting into it. But it really comes to the fact that we live in a world where we equate valuing something with paying for it. And I really think that is some ways the secularization of Christianity. Indulgences have always been there, but I think the arrival of prosperity gospel has been as much about the, bringing secular ideas into the church as promoting these particular doctrines within the church.
Well, indulgences were meant for your soul to prosper in the next life, whereas a lot of this is a lot more, I want to be prospering now.
Yeah.
Why wait until heaven? I want to have wealth and health now, which makes sense. The whole fiasco with indulgences that led to the Reformation was that you can't just sell places in hell or heaven but with this, it's well, you don't even need to think that far ahead. You could just have a better life here. It's heaven on earth, really, in its most fundamental principles.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's 100% right. But then there's a bit of a twist, and this is someone who's pretty critical of this prosperity gospel culture. There is actually quite a lot of evidence that it winds up working. And I mean, Kate Bowler, whose book I mentioned earlier, she said that, something that critics rarely acknowledge is that when a lot of people say prosperity, they really mean survival. And that, prosperity is understood in a different ways, but in a different way by, a lot of the poorest of the poor. And that for a lot of ordinary believers, this is the same quest for abundance that, say, liberation theology was clued into as well. Obviously came up with very different solutions to the same problem, but it was a basic understanding of this, that the hand-to-mouth existence, that there is a role for spirituality in that. And there is a growing body of evidence that the prosperity gospel does deliver to people, particularly in Brazil, where I mentioned before, and actually just across wider South America. There is a lot of evidence that people who come from poverty, cycles of violence, abuse, and addiction have better chances of escaping that world if they join an evangelical and particularly a Pentecostal church. So it kind of becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy of God's favor being shown in material well-being, and then they're getting up and giving their testimony, and their neighbors are seeing their lives improve once they started going to church, and become more pious, and that tends to bring more and more people in. And it can just be as simple as if you're trying to get off alcohol and you're accountable to be at church on Sunday morning because the pastor might come round afterwards or something like that, you're going to have a better chance of not going out on Saturday night. You're going to have a better chance of sticking to your sobriety program. And that's been a really, really big thing as I mentioned, particularly in South America.
Well, you could always sober up for your 8 a.m. appointment with a little bit of help from friends in Colombia, let us say.
Yeah, the third great South American tradition.
Yeah.
And even more interestingly, in a political sense, Brazilian research has found that for every 1% reduction in a country's GDP, so say, for example, you elect a dickhead like Bolsonaro who just puts in all these stupid policies and takes away a lot of social safety, and that reduces people's incomes and spending power, and that, eventually eats into the country's GDP. So for every 1% reduction in that, there's a 0.8% increase in the number of people who go to evangelical churches. And the theory is that basically that's because they are, providing vulnerable people with solidarity networks and basic services and, help in raising a family, food aid, things like that the state has failed to provide. So ultimately that is giving these ideas about the prosperity gospel, they're not only succeeding where states fail, but they're offering an incentive for states to be failed. And I think that ultimately that is why it's become such a getting in bed with these very charismatic Pentecostal leaders who do promote this overall idea of prosperity gospel. It's why it became such a big part for Bolsonaro, Trump, Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia. Javier Milei has gotten really into it in Argentina, even though he's Jewish, I believe. I
think he's a convert to Judaism, like an adult convert.
Yeah. Well, as we've spoken about in another recent episode about, weirdness of adult converts.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's been doing a lot with evangelical churches specifically because, Catholic churches have criticized him a bit, and a lot of his boosters have come from the sort of burgeoning Pentecostal evangelical movement. So he's giving out a lot of state service contracts and things like that exclusively to evangelical churches. And my kind of overall theory is that is why there has been such a bond with these sort of new right authoritarians and the Pentecostal movement.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you see it to a lesser extent, for example, in Egypt, right, when Sadat applied his infitah policies, which are the imposition of neoliberalism and the dismantling of the Nasserist state, right? That led to a significant boost in popularity of the Muslim Brotherhood because the Brotherhood took over that vacuum of social services that the state sort of receded from under Sadat. Now, with the Brotherhood, it's not so much that it doesn't really drive the state to fail. It doesn't have that influence, for one. It's not responsible for the state's failing as they do. That's more of just the neoliberal project, reigning supreme in the Middle East. But you do see Islamist groups tend to do really well as the state recedes because they provide social services as, healthcare, childcare, housing, and things like that to a population that feels abandoned. And for them, if the local mosque is the only way I can get meds or whatever, then like, sure, maybe they have a few other good ideas about politics.
But you can see it. It certainly has echoes across like so many different parts of the world.
Yeah.
Cool. So that is a very brief history of the prosperity gospel. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next week.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a good one.